looking at the possibility of implementing the Emergencies Act and developing these orders. In developing those orders, we tried to be as practical and targeted as possible. And that's why we wanted to ensure that information could be shared with various enforcement forces, including the RCMP. We had discussions with the RCMP and with the financial institution to ensure that we basically implemented or helped to the extent possible, provide the information with respect to the Emergencies Act and these orders. These are not the type of orders, I mean, it was the first time, I think, in 35 years, or if ever, that the Emergencies Act was ever used. We're working on very tight timelines, and the implementation was quite rapid. We're also working with evolving facts. We didn't know what we were looking at. You know, the situation was evolving. There were various information circulating. And when you're trying, anybody that has tried to develop policies, even in normal circumstances, and to ensure that these policies are properly reflected into law and to apply that law, I mean, even that is not a simple factor. So I think to the extent that we developed the emergency, the order, and that we had a successful implementation of that order, in my view, was quite a feat, because we focused on the people that were, the focus was on the people that were involved in illegal activities and that were, funding those illegal activities. We also told people ahead of time that if they continue to fund illegal activities or be involved in those illegal activities, that the bank accounts could be frozen. People had noticed ahead of time, and if a decision was made to stay on the premises, to continue to stay involved in those activities, these people knew what could happen.
Let's move to that point exactly. In your institutional report, and we can call it up if you want, but you described one of the purposes of the Emergency Economic Measures Order as to dissuade ongoing participation in the protests. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And you might not have heard the evidence of Deputy Commissioner Duhem, but he used the expression deter and disrupt. So the concept of deterrence from the RCMP, from the Department of Finance, we have the concept of dissuasion, so probably synonyms for the same concept.
I think a better word for how we were thinking about this is to create a set of incentives to bring a peaceful end to these disruptions.
I'll just expand on that, or allow you to expand on that, Mr. Sabia, because I think that's a good point. One of the prime objectives of dealing with the convoy problems in the way that the Emergency Economic Measures Order was fashioned was to find a way to bring a peaceful end to the demonstration, because if you could do it with freezing bank accounts or whatever other measures were necessary, that was an awful lot better than having to go in with police and clubs, right?
I think it's, again, a statement of the obvious.
Yes.
A peaceful end to almost anything is better than a non-peaceful end. And that's very much what we were focused on here, was to create, as I've said, a set of incentives for the point having been made. I mean, people have every right to protest. That's an important part of our democratic system. And there were no easy answers here. But finding instruments that create an environment where people have an incentive to go home, having made their point, that seems to us to be a path worth pursuing.
And again, I think I'm trying to amplify your point, better than going in with the police, if you can get it to happen the way you just described.
Well, I think, from what I understand, the testimony that this commission's been hearing from law enforcement, and indeed, I think from Superintendent Beaudoin as well, I think there's a pretty wide acknowledgement that these financial measures did help law enforcement to bring an end to these in as peaceful a way as they possibly could. And I think law enforcement has been pretty consistent on acknowledging the positive contribution that these measures have made. And I'd just like to go back to your previous set of questions.
By all means.
I mean, I will admit to being a little puzzled about your point. So in my mind, this is actually pretty straightforward. Now, you know, I didn't go to law school, so maybe I'm missing something.
That's an advantage.
Well, my daughter is finishing law school, so I don't know. I'm of two minds about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. In any event. So what did we do? At the Department of Finance, we basically set policies. So we set a policy that said, under the authority of the Emergencies Act having already declared certain activities illegal, we set a policy that said the financial system, bank accounts.
My name is Brendan Miller, and I am counsel for Freedom Corp, which is the entity that represents the protesters that were in Ottawa in January and February of 2022. I have a few questions for the three of you, and hopefully we can get through this in the 20 minutes that I have. So first, I want to talk to you about money laundering and terrorist financing. You've kind of mentioned that previously. And of course, that's dealt with via the FINTRAC legislation, correct?
That's correct.
And you can agree with me that the protesters in Ottawa were not terrorists, correct?
I have no information to that effect.
You have no information to the effect that they were terrorists, right?
That is correct. That's not information that I'd be privy to.
And you have no information that the protesters in Ottawa were laundering money. Isn't that right?
The Department of Finance did not receive any information to that effect.
Right.
It's not information that we would typically
Right.
receive.
But Deputy Minister, you can agree that during the IRG meetings, you were present.
Yes.
Right. And at no time during those meetings were you ever informed that any of the protesters in Ottawa were terrorists or were money laundering. Is that
Sorry,
correct?
just to interject for a moment, and as far as the questions asking what ministers may have discussed amongst themselves in those meetings, that would be covered by cabinet.
I'll rephrase. Between the dates of February 10 and February 14th, 2022, at no time were you informed that there was terrorists within the protesters in Ottawa, correct?
All I can say in reaction to your question is that the responsible agencies were watchful on that point, and it was not
Sir?
an area where
Sir?
we had any expertise.
Sir, I understand that, but I'm not asking that. I just want a yes or no. You were never informed that these individuals in Ottawa, between the dates of February 10th and February 14th, were terrorists, correct?
We had no information one way or the other on that issue.
Right. So the answer is no.
I said we had no information one way or the other on that.
So you have no information one way or the other. Let's make it clear. You were not informed. You were given no information that these individuals in Ottawa protesting were terrorists, yes or no?
Well, I'm not going to give you a yes or no answer because my answer is that we didn't have information on that one way or the other. It's just not an issue that we were involved in, cognizant of, et cetera.
But was it not I understand from the records that FINTRAC and the Ministry of Finance, based on a report in the media on January 25th, with respect to the crowdfunding, all right? That is what brought this to their attention, and FINTRAC and the Department of Finance started to look at these individuals in Ottawa with respect to financing. Can you agree with that?
Well, no, I can't because I don't have enough information to enable me to. What I mean, at the time, we are not, and it's quite appropriate, we are not privy to information that FINTRAC has. That information, FINTRAC, as you know, is an agency that is all about intelligence gathering, detection, et cetera. It's not about enforcement.
Okay, so
And so that information, just hang on one sec. That information goes directly, in the case of suspicious transactions or concerns about money laundering, whatever, that information goes directly from the leadership of FINTRAC to law enforcement authorities. It never comes our way.
right, and I take it that between February 10th and February 14th, no law enforcement official informed you that there was money laundering going on with respect to the protest in Ottawa, did they?
I was not informed of anything with respect to money laundering one way or the other.
So, and I think, it's fair to say then that the FINTRAC legislation and the legislation dealing with terrorist financing and money laundering simply had no application to the protesters, did it?
No, it did. Maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but it did in that through that process, it confirmed that we needed to adjust the regulatory perimeter of FINTRAC to include crowdfunding platforms and payment processors. So we did do that on a temporary basis under the authority of the Emergencies Act. And we applied it only to, in that act, only to crowdfunding and payment processors
Okay.
who had information
Right, and I understand
with
that.
these illicit activities.
So
And then we made it longer term.
Before that protest and before the invocation of the Emergencies Act, there was no authority to do that, right? That's why you needed you're saying that's why you needed this. Is that fair?
That crowdfunding platforms and payment processors were not subject to review by FINTRAC. Yes,
Right.
that's accurate.
But even if they were not the crowdfunding, et cetera, if there was terrorist financing and there was money laundering, then you could apply FINTRAC and the criminal code to crowdfunding, right? Without the Emergencies Act.
I can't answer that question because I'm not expert enough in FINTRAC's legislation.
Okay. So I want to talk to you a bit about some crowdfunding. With respect to crowdfunding, you can agree it's done by way of people donating to a fund online, right?
Yes.
And people donate to that fund typically to support a cause.
Yes, that's one, yes.
And can you agree with me that some causes set up in crowdfunding are set up for a political cause?
I'm sure that's probably true.
And can you agree that a protest of a government policy or legislation is a political cause?
Well, I'm not going to answer your question in my capacity as the Deputy Minister of Finance. I guess I'm going to answer your question in my capacity as a citizen. And I guess my answer as a citizen is, yeah, that sounds like it makes sense to me.
Right. And can you admit that the GoFundMe and the Give, Send, Go for crowdfunding set up by Ms. Litch and the protesters in Ottawa were a crowd fund set up to support a political cause?
Well, I guess, as you know well, GoFundMe ended up, in effect, refusing to continue to provide its platform for these funding activities.
And we'll get into that.
So GoFundMe obviously came to some conclusions about what was underway here that caused them to be uncomfortable enough that they wanted to
Right.
restrict this from their platform.
Right, I understand that. But can you agree that when the GoFundMe was set up in January 14th, prior to the protest, prior to them arriving here, that this GoFundMe, this crowd fund, was set up to support a political cause?
Well, it was set up to support the fundraising activities of the people who were protesting both in Ottawa and I guess across the country.
Right, and you agree that the protests are a political cause.
Formally, we made it a standing meeting every day at the same time, but we were checking in to see what we knew and what could be done to end this protest every day, and we were briefing ministers.
And DMOC was chaired by you.
Yes.
Is DMOC always chaired by you, or was that specific to this circumstance because it was a security thing?
As long as it has existed, it's been chaired by the National Security Advisor.
What other kind of meetings were you participating in?
That's the majority of it. So with deputy ministers, hearing what the ADMs were doing, and then the law enforcement meetings were going on in parallel. And certainly Op Intersect was meeting in parallel.
And what about with the externally to the federal government? Were you participating in meetings that involved other authorities, municipal, provincial?
Not in the first weekend, not until the first meeting with the city.
And when was that in your recollection?
I don't have the date in front of me, but we have the information available. So it was the first meeting that Rob Stewart called. I had asked, I'm new in the job, we're meeting every day to understand what we can do, what action can be taken, who has what authority. And I asked if I can call the city. What is my role vis-a-vis the city being a federal authority? Discussed it with Deputy Minister Stewart because he has the federal policing responsibility and that secretariat works for him. It was decided he would do the reach out to the city. And that's how we had our first meeting with the city manager and Chief Slowly.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, can you pull up ONT 50159? So this is a summary of a call that was held with the city, the federal government, and the provincial government on February 6th. This may be the first meeting that you were talking about. It may be the second.
Second,
can't
I would say.
remember offhand. Pardon me?
Second.
It's the second. Okay. So I want to ask you about something specific.
Required to have been found.
No, I don't agree.
So it can go beyond what the Act says, which is a threat to the security of Canada.
There are other definitions of threats to the security of Canada, as we saw earlier.
Right, but not in the legislation.
The Emergency Act allows for the governor and council to make a broad decision about public
That's-
order emergencies.
That's not what it says, but you can agree with me.
I
that-
think that this is an argument to have with lawyers.
Well, I understand that. So let's go through then just what Section 2 of the CSIS Act says, and I'll just ask you a couple of questions about the grounds. And we've already heard from every law enforcement official, as well as we have the statements from CSIS and evidence, that they didn't have reasonable suspicion that any of this was taking place. So I take it that you can agree with me that you didn't have any evidence with you before cabinet or even considered of any espionage or sabotage against Canada that is detrimental to the interests of Canada or activities directed towards or in support of such espionage or sabotage, right?
That's been discussed, yes.
Right. And so that, there was no evidence of that that you considered
No,
in your assessment. And you could agree with me that there's no evidence of foreign influenced activities within or related to Canada that are detrimental to the interests of Canada, are clandestine or deceptive, or involve a threat to any person, correct?
there were threats to people.
Right. By email and Twitter, right?
I would submit that in the social media era, you cannot ignore threats against officials and public office holders just because they are on social media. That would be inexcusably negligent.
Right, but that's up to the police to deal with, or is that a national emergency?
It depends on the situation in the context in which those threats arrive.
Okay, can we please bring up document ts.nsc.can.001 000000206_rel0001. Oh, apologies, just a second. Wrong one. I'll just say the end numbers. Same forward. 159_rel 0001. Okay, so I take it that you're familiar with the CSIS assessment that they provided on the Freedom Convoy in downtown Ottawa, right?
That's one of the assessments.
Right, okay. And their assessment was this, and at the beginning, you see downtown Ottawa was actually quite festive, not threatening to a passerby. Some criminal acts did occur, law enforcement. And again, you've said you're not an intelligence officer, you don't have any training as an intelligence analysis, so I take it you rely on CSIS for intelligence.
CSIS provides one input on intelligence, yes.
Yeah, and then the RCMP?
Another input,
Right, and then the Canadian Border Services agencies?
another input,
Right, and then you also have the Canadian Security Establishment?
yes.
Right, okay. None of those people provided you intelligence that there was a Section 2 CSIS Act threat?
Again, we've been through this. There are other measures other than Section 2 of the CSIS Act.
So let's scroll down, if we can. And you'll see in there with respect to the flags, now, I take it there was concern with these flags that there was a couple of flags that were seen that were inappropriate, and that was one of the reasons why there was a consideration of ideological motivated violent extremism. You can see there that I understand that their report is a very small number of more inflammatory flags, Confederate, Nazi, swastika, 3%er, Punisher, based on the 1974 comic book hero, and Quebec Patriot flag. And then they say that a random flag is just a flag until the reason the person holding it explains why. Flags can have multiple meanings and are routinely co-opted by various groups, individuals. No way of connecting those views holding flags with any online content. The presence of 3% flags, for example, does not necessarily mean that members of the 3% are in attendance. And that was the intelligence you were given.
That's part of the intelligence we were given. That's intelligence that can be released.
Okay, so what do you mean intelligence can be released? So,
Well, there's Section 38.
right, I understand that. But why don't we scroll down? Now, this is important. And you know that CSIS does, in fact, because there's no reason, you don't need a law to look at what's online or open source intelligence, that it's open source intelligence. Anybody can look at it without a law authorizing it. Can you agree with that?
No, the reality is that open source intelligence has to be anonymized so that we are not targeting specific people who are not under investigation. So it's not quite as simple as you're depicting it.
Well, ma'am, again, there's no privacy interest for Canadians on things they post online. Anybody can go on and read it, right? You know that.
Yes, but the privacy commissioner and the privacy laws of this country are such that they cannot then their information cannot be scraped and be part of an assessment writ large. There has to be boundaries around that.
Around its distribution.
No, around its analysis and collection.
Right, and that's
And
why.
storage.
And that's why we have units in the RCMP that do that.
Some of it, yes.
Right, so you have I believe it's called the IMCIT unit. That's all they look at, is they look at online violent rhetoric and assess it.
For criminal purposes, yes.
Right, and so for violent rhetoric, what are your other purposes other than criminal purposes?
Well, so I would like to be a little more expansive in this answer, if I may be. An analyst looks at a piece of information for very specific issues. When we, as people advising, and it's my deputy minister colleagues and I, to advise the cabinet and decision makers on the threat, the confidence in government institutions, the rhetoric, we have to look more broadly than at specific elements as described here. Someone should kill the PM. Wouldn't it be great if someone killed the PM? that says something. And it's not just random because they can't identify it to an individual and it doesn't say the day,
So-
doesn't mean it doesn't matter.
So what are you looking for? Are you looking that the government without warrants is allowed just to go and look into metadata?
No, that's what I just said to you.
Yeah, so
I just said to you
Here's
that
the
we
thing.
should not be doing that. And so we have to find a legal framework for it. We are actually violently agreeing.
okay, well, that's good. So, and we agree that we should follow legal frameworks.
We should. And I believe there is a gap in the legal
Yeah,
framework.
and you agree we should follow the legal framework in the Emergencies Act, right?
And we have.
Okay.
Folks, if you want to be kept up to date on what's happening at the Emergency Act inquiry, including my live tweets and some clips and highlights that occurring at the Emergency Act inquiry, by heading over to revolutionnews.ca/Emergency Act Commission. That's revolutionnews.ca/Emergency Act Commission. And of course, folks, while you're there, please head over to donorbox.org/Emergency Act Commission. That's donorbox.org/Emergency Act Commission. And of course, folks, if you could chip in a buck or two, that will be greatly appreciated, as it will help me cover my travel expenses, including my expenses on food, as bringing you these stories doesn't come for free. Thank you so much.